Great. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm super excited to be talking about user-centered design. My name is Pajal Van Gay, and I'm the community manager over at the National Microbiome Data Collaborative. We have a really great lineup of panelists, so thanks again for joining us today. So if today's your first time joining a community conversation, I wanted to give you a really quick background on what the National Microbiome Data Collaborative is. So we're a pilot project, and we're currently developing a data science ecosystem to make microbiome multi-omic data more findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. This means that many of you out there who are researchers probably are well aware that it's really difficult to find the microbiome data that you're looking for. So what we're working on is making sure that the metadata associated with that is standardized, as well as the data products are actually run through standardized bioinformatic workflows. You could learn more by checking out our website on the left-hand side here, following us on Twitter, and then explore GitHub as well as our data portal link at the bottom of this slide. So you might be wondering why we're talking about user-centered design. So the thing I really want to point out is that in addition to building out the data infrastructure to do what we're planning on doing, engaging with the research community is also a huge strategic priority for us. So I've put in the faces of our champions and ambassadors here, and these are researchers in our microbiome research community who've partnered with us, and they're engaging really closely with us to make sure that what we're developing is actually meeting the needs of the research community. So huge thanks to them, first and foremost. And then they're also the first in line to give us feedback on usability, as well as on other aspects that we're working on, like our workflows, as well as our other platforms. So for example, our data portal, which you can start exploring right now if you're interested at datamicrobiomedata.org, is a way that you can start discovering and exploring the data that we have available. And throughout this process of prototyping this website and this interface, we've sat down with researchers iteratively to explore how they're discovering data and to improve this process. And so we've gone through about 4 or 5 different rounds of usability testing. Our champions and our ambassadors have been actively involved with this. And I'm really excited to share that a lot of the features that you'll see when you start exploring have been informed by our usability interviews. So for example, our global text search, which has this really nice auto suggesting that pops up as you type, our pan and zoom of the map feature, as well as being able to select biosamples with particular multi-omic data that you might be interested in. And then last but not least, being able to download the data that you're interested in bulk. So again, a huge thanks to those who have sat down with us before. And I'll stop here and to kind of just give a quick overview of who's going to be joining us today to talk a little bit about their own work in terms of user-centered design in their own projects, but then to also be joining us with a Q&A at the latter half of today's session. So really excited to introduce Paul Parsons, who's an assistant professor over at Purdue, Linda Setchell, who is the director of product at Katmai, Ilya Zaslavsky, if I'm saying that right, who's the director of the Spatial Info Systems Lab at UCSD. And then of course we have Sarah O'Connor as well, who's the operations manager at NOAA's Chorus project. So without further ado, I'm gonna pass it over to Paul to get it started.
All right, sure, thanks for that. Let me just share my screen here. And hopefully you can see my slides. Let me know if not. So I'm going to talk just for a few minutes about user-centered design, and then we're going to move on to the other panelists. And so just to give you a little context about where I'm coming from, specifically in relation to working with people like you all folks on the call. I work with the Science Gateways Community Institute, and I think a few of you I recognize on the call, working with you through that group, where I've done more than 50 consulting engagements at this time since 2018, where the focus is on usability, user-centered design, user experience. And so really what that means is I've worked with a range of projects, mostly research-focused, scientific cyber infrastructure kinds of projects, evaluating usability and taking a user-centered design approach to working on those engagements. And these have been across a whole range of disciplines, including life sciences and a whole range of others, various scientific fields, educational platforms for chemistry, for mathematics, social media, cybersecurity, and others. And what I was thinking about what would be useful to talk to you all for a few minutes about and put into these slides. I think probably I don't need to convince you that user-centered design is useful, otherwise you probably wouldn't be here. But what I thought is that I could maybe take some insights from working on these projects for several years that might not be so obvious, even to people who appreciate user-centered design, and just share a couple of those with you. And so that's what I'll do just for the next couple minutes. So I've worked on these projects, on these consulting sorts of projects for several years. And more recently, I've been engaged in an interview study. Let me just see if I can move this panel out of the way here. Can't see my mouse, of course it's going to do that to me. Anyway, an interview study with 18 out of these 50 projects. And this is a really in-depth study trying to understand the role of user experience for cyber infrastructure researchers and developers, people who maintain and create this kind of software. And looking at themes and patterns that pop up across this whole range of disciplines in reference to user-centered design. So that's what I'm going to do and share a couple things with you. And so just a really high-level description of what user-centered design is. And I like to think of it as, in the simplest sense, as having just three sort of components. One is that we need to understand people, users, communities, and so we can call that user research. We investigate users and what they need. We build things in the most basic sense, and so we prototype, we develop software, and so on. And then we also evaluate, and that can look many different ways, but ideally there's some sort of connections back and forth across all of these. And so that's a really high-level description of, the really basic things that I think are involved there. What I'm going to show you next is maybe a little bit of the nuance that goes on in that sort of relationship among those things. And so basically I'm going to emphasize 2 points, and that's it. And then that might open up some questions for the second part of the panel. And so, but I think they're interesting. I think they're useful. So we'll see. So the first one is about timing. And so when we talk about user-centered design or usability in the context of all the stuff that goes into doing scientific sorts of research, cyber infrastructure development and maintenance and so on, what's the right way to think about timing? And so often what ends up happening in these projects that I've worked on is people build stuff, right? Scientists build stuff, researchers build stuff, and then they say, for one reason or another, we need to evaluate this. We need to think about usability. Maybe people are complaining, or maybe not. They just say, oh, this is probably a good thing. And so we get contacted and they say, can you come and look at things and tell us, whether this is usable or not? And then what ends up happening is we go back and say, okay, well, first we need to really understand the people and the community. And so we go back to this step. And then that typically results in suggestions or recommendations to say, you got to go back into the building mode and change things. And that can sort of cycle around a few times. And what I want to show next is a quote from a participant in this interview study that may or may not seem obvious, but I think there's some interesting nuance there that I'll lead into the next slide. And so what this is saying here, this participant is describing their experience after working with us, and then describing sort of how people think about user-centered design and usability. And so what they're saying is, for a long time, cyber infrastructure software folks would say, here's the general problem. This is the thing that they're interested in, that needs to be solved. And then, where are users, right? So they try to solve a problem that they're interested in, and then they say, where are the users? I've heard over and over in projects or communities, some of the most successful and sustainable projects start with the community, and then they figure out exactly what that means. And they build whatever is built in conjunction with that community. And then they sort of are trying to make a recommendation here and saying, the thing that a usability person would offer as part of, as a partner early on in these cyber infrastructure projects is sort of forcing the developers to listen to the scientists, and for the scientists to actually articulate their needs. And sometimes those can't be easily articulated unless someone helps them envision solutions. So there's two sort of big points here, I think. One is that oftentimes these projects start with researchers who have a particular need. And so they say, let's create some software. And maybe it's with the vision to expand it to other people, maybe not, but often it ends up doing that. And then the community piece, the user research piece comes in a bit late. And then the second one is that even if you recognize that and say, let's really figure out the user research part of it, let's really figure out what the community needs, it's not often as easy as it might seem. And so just asking somebody, what do you need? People aren't always so good at articulating that in a useful way. And so that's the bottom piece of that there. And so I thought that was a really interesting insight. I've seen that in different forms across several participants in this study. And so this leads to the second point, 2 out of 2. The second point that I want to emphasize here is really the framing and the scoping of how we do user research, how we do user-centered design, and how we approach understanding a community's needs. And so this is a quote from another participant, looking back on the work that we did with them and how they're thinking about user-centered design. So here they say, and so I have to go through that process of making sure I understand people's questions fully, and that a lot of people try to be helpful and say, I need help with this specific thing. But it turns out, if you go backwards, they actually don't. They thought that was right, and they need this other thing instead. And so maybe I also have more perspective now on, you have to take that time to do the scoping and make sure you understand the needs, and that you're actually getting the right answer, whether it's the question the users asked or not. And so that's building on the previous participant who's saying that it's not always so easy to articulate those things. And so those are just 2 things that sort of stood out to me while I was thinking about this that might be useful for discussion. And so if we go back to this thing that I showed earlier, what might seem simple initially is not always so simple. So there's nuance there. We have to ask, when is the right time to do things, to do these different steps, and how do we do it? And so there are several methods and things. I'm not going to talk about that. But even just saying, let's just ask people what they want, doesn't always give us the right insight. And so we end up building something that's not very useful for the problem or the opportunity that's at hand. So I'm going to stop there. That's what I wanted to say as an intro, and I will pass it on to our next speaker.
Great. Thanks so much, Paul, for starting us off and framing everything. I'm going to be driving the slides for our speaker, so give me 1 second. All right. Linda, would you like to start us off? He can't hear you. I think you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm always on mute. Hey, my name is Linda. As they mentioned at the top, I am a director of product for a startup. And today I'm going to share a few tips for incorporating UCD into the product development process. So building off of some of the stuff that Paul talked about. So I'm going to talk about 3 phases of the process. The first phase that I like to talk about is product discovery. And there are kind of 2 big buckets or types of product discovery, depending on the project you're undertaking. For existing products, such as the Genome Portal, which is how I got involved with sort of NMDC and the Joint Genome Institute, the goal is really to understand the problems that need to be solved. So why are we coming in? What's wrong with the existing product? What challenges need to be resolved? For new products, the goal is to understand what problems potential users have before you start building. And so we'll go through each of these quickly. For existing products and the product discovery process, it's important to get curious and don't assume you know. Can you flip to the next slide? Sorry. So it's important to get curious and don't assume you know. So even if you are internal to the organization, perhaps you've worked on this product for a really long time, take a step back and say, all right, we have some challenges. I think I understand what these challenges are, but let me do some investigation just to verify. And so these are some of the things you want to tackle. The first is to talk to stakeholders at every level of the organization to see if there's agreement on the problem space and what may be causing the problem. The mini goal of this stakeholder conversation is to obtain historical context about how the current product arrived in its present state. So you may know that, but you may have come in halfway. And it's really important to go back and get the whole historical context during this process. During this phase, you're also going to want to review existing user data and analytics data to see if it matches what you find in conversations. And then also usability test the existing product with real users to see if the challenges they encounter match the ones you've heard about from stakeholders. And then based on those results, you're going to develop some hypotheses and solutions to test with users during the next phase. So this is for an existing product discovery. If we look at new product discovery, you can go to the next slide. Sorry, I should have done. I'm not very good at doing slides and doing this thing. So thank you. For new product discovery, it's a bit different. In this case, you're going to start with an idea or a hypothesis that you want to validate or invalidate. So let's say you want to build a new data portal for sharing medicinal plant genomic sequencing data. The first thing you're going to want to do is brainstorm possible user groups for this new data portal. And then set up interviews to ask them about their work and the biggest challenges they have in completing their work. What you're doing during these interviews is listening for a problem that could be solved by your solution. You don't have to talk about your solution directly during those interviews. Instead, you're really listening for their problems to understand, to see if you're seeing patterns across different user groups. You're going to analyze that feedback, look for those patterns, and if enough feedback indicates a need for this type of portal, start solutioning an MVP or prototype. And if the data doesn't indicate a need, you can go back to the interviews and see what other problems came up that you could potentially solve, and then go back and dig into those problem spaces as well. And this is a really great way to make sure you're understanding the problem space before you even start building. The next phase, once you have sort of an idea of where you want to head, some solutions you want to try out, is the design and prototype testing phase. So the goal of this stage is to validate whether your solution meets the needs of end users. And by validating at this design stage, you can avoid engineering a solution no one wants to use or one that doesn't meet the needs of end users. So you can sort of escape that trap a little bit by designing and prototype testing at this phase. So one of the most important things for this phase is to really keep your prototype simple, 1 to 2 colors at most, because the purpose is to test the solution or the interaction patterns and not necessarily the aesthetics. If you're not a designer, you can use tools like Whimsical and InDesign combined together to create functional prototypes for testing with users. And once again, you're going to analyze that feedback and you're going to either iterate on your prototype designs or go ahead and head to the build stage. So this is one of the prototypes for the data portal. It's actually the first one that we tested. And for JGI, we iterated on prototypes a few times before building each sort of section of the data portal. So I'm going to show you 3 today. This is the first one we started with. During this interview process, when we were talking to users, we heard things that made us completely reevaluate the approach we were taking to downloading data. And so it's really important, even at this stage, to kind of listen for things that make you say, oh, wait, we may have missed something during the discovery process. Let's dig into that piece over here and figure out if that makes sense or not. In this case, what we were hearing is that researchers wanted to download multiple organisms and not just a single organism one at a time, because the research they were doing had changed. Once you get to the build and learn stage, it's really important to also usability test at this stage. So no matter how many prototype iterations you went through, you want to test with real users and real data in production. For data intensive products, you may need to iterate on the interface a few times to meet end user needs. So for the data portal, this is the next iteration of the download, sort of a download workflow. We learned that the phylogenetic tree display featured above didn't really make sense to end users once they encountered it with live data and tried to find their organisms for research. So even though we had gone through multiple prototype testing phases with users, when we got it into production with real data, we still found that this wasn't quite right and wasn't going to work for researchers. After a few iterations, we eventually landed on a filter and table view to help researchers narrow their selections. So kind of under this blue bar, you can filter by different elements. And then these are the results down below for corn at this point, like maize. And those will adjust as you apply the filters. The last thing I want to just throw up here is that UCD is a team sport. And as much as possible, make sure that your engineers and your other cross-functional team members, whether they're data scientists or marketing team members, et cetera, are really involved in this process. You know, they also have other responsibilities, but making recorded interviews available, inviting them to insights and action sessions, et cetera, are really important. And lastly, if you're kicking off a project, this is a good, like, sort of basic timeline or outline for getting started. So expect to spend, 4 to 6 weeks on a product discovery and doing those stakeholder interviews and things like that. Then you can sort of split up doing both design and prototype tests, and then foundational infrastructure building for your engineering team, and then continue with your sort of build and learn process. And that's all I have.
Great, thanks so much, Linda. That was really helpful, additional framing and background for everybody to see how things work. So I'm excited to now pass it on to Ilya, and Ilya and Sarah are going to actually showcase some projects where they used UCD. So Ilya, if you want to go ahead and start chatting.
Yes. Thank you very much for inviting me. Ilya Zaslavsky from San Diego Supercomputer Center. I will briefly mention two projects that I've been involved in, which incorporated user-centered design. One is a data discovery platform for geoscience data, and the second one is our recent work on agent-based modeling of COVID transmission in schools. Next slide. So in the first project, we assembled metadata from more than 1.6 million data sets into a system and developed a platform to automatically enhance search metadata using ontologies and text parsing, and that was published as online user interface and a set of services so that users would be able to find data using several modes of search, organizes data into collections, and launch code to visualize or analyze this data in Jupyter. So it actually has some features similar to the NMDC portal that Pajao mentioned. In this project, we were fortunate to work with this GCI team. Before that, of course, we had user workshops and interviews and showed the system at multiple workshops, had questionnaires. But the real change came with SGCI. So together we looked at what features of the system worked well, which were not used in the, and which did not work well, and we did that in a systematic fashion, and streamlined the design based on comparison with other projects, interviews, cognitive walkthrough. So I put here on this slide titles of a few reports produced by Paul Parsons' team. These were indeed very helpful in prioritizing development and kind of tuning it to the audience. Next slide. So the second project is actually a student project that started in my independent study class in mid-2020. We initially developed an agent-based model of COVID transmission in schools. And then it quickly turned out that we need to transition it to a gateway because the model would be run on Comet and then on Expand supercomputer, because otherwise it would simply be impossible to do it in real time online. So users would specify inputs to the model to explore effects of so-called non-pharmaceutical interventions, such as mask wearing, class occupancy, location of lunch, whether windows are open or closed, both in a classroom setting and on school buses. So we also worked with SGCI on this project, but on the Ayurveda portal and not as much on usability. On the usability and user-centered design, we worked with very closely with San Diego Health and Human Services Agency and getting feedback directly from school administrators who were very eager to help. And one of the extensions of this work, which is very heavily used now, is so-called e-decision tree. I will mention it again in the discussion because this is our most recent foray into user-centric design, where we have several interesting issues there, such as the audience of our clients, our users, changed over time quite significantly, and that required some adjustments. And we also focused on delivering immediate value to these users, which I guess is a very important component of usability. Next slide. So knowing your audience is the key in any project, and tracking changes in the user base is also very important. Also, we found that establishing several channels for your users to provide feedback is a key, and it's probably even more important to talk to them and get to know what they really think about your product and what they can do with it. But as I said, well, what is the key is to deliver value to the users, content that is up to date, and something that they can use immediately. In that case, they would tolerate imperfections in interface design, and those would not deter them from using the system. And it's also critical to have a partner such as SGCI, because we've been extremely happy about this collaboration and the project that we engaged in. Thank you. So I'll have more to say during the discussion.
Great, thanks so much, Ilya. Yeah, lots of time left for the panel discussion. So if you have any questions, feel free to save them for that time or write it in the shared notes doc. All right, thanks so much. Next, I'd like to invite Sarah to present.
Thank you. So my name is Sarah O'Connor, and today I'm going to be talking a little bit about how we use the Coral Reef Information System and how we've used stakeholder engagement to influence the project's development within NOAA. Next. So the Coral Reef Information System, or CORIS, was established about 20 years ago, shortly after the Coral Program's creation in 2001. And at the time of the development, the primary purpose or goal of the portal was to provide unified access to data, products, and outreach materials. Next. In the initial development of the portal, we received a number of requirements from our sponsor, but we had very limited engagement with our actual stakeholders. One of the first things that they had asked us to do was develop a child search. This is essentially if you have a product suite, you would only list the product suite once in the catalog and launch a secondary search. This goes back to the early 2000s, so the graphics are definitely dated there. But as you see on the left-hand side, we had a number of URLs, one of which launched the child search. Next. The problem or confusion we had with stakeholders was that most of our data providers already had child or granule searches on their actual websites. And they had a much more focused search that could provide users exactly what they wanted and provided more functionality than we could do in a generic child search across multiple data types. So this was really determined to be a requirement that they didn't actually want implemented. So it was kind of a failure and deprecated quickly. Next. Another failure out of the gate was taxonomic searches. We were told that users wanted to be able to search the data by fish species or coral species. We developed a solution, but it was pretty labor intensive, and we discovered early on that our content providers were not actually willing to do the work. So without reliable input, the search was declared useless by the users and eventually deprecated. Next. So with a couple of failures under our belt, we decided to sort of reorganize and try and figure out how to engage with stakeholders in a more effective manner. The Coral program within NOAA crosses 4 offices, and we also have a number of thematic areas where staff might work across multiple offices. So we gathered a core group of staff together from each office as well as each topical or focus area. So we had a key group of stakeholders. Next. And these groups are involved in sort of what we call our core team meetings. Those happen every month to every 2 months, and we ask a lot of questions of them. They're some of the first group we reach out to for what new features or services they would like to see. We also ask them about the challenges, both from the user's perspective as our portal, as well as what they're aware of from the content provider's perspective. If we're asking too many asks of our content providers, they're not going to be willing to participate. And we found that the content providers were more willing to complain to them than actually complain to us. So that was a key sort of bridging the gap. And our core team is critical in reviewing our storyboards, prototypes, and final products in an iterative process. But while the core team is useful, they are not our complete group of stakeholders. So we also do a number of outreach efforts through seminars, meeting brief outs, and field visits. As you can see from the map, the US coral reef areas pretty much cross a large portion of the globe. So pre-pandemic, at least, we were trying to go to one location each year to both meet with NOAA scientists as well as local managers on the ground. Next. So one of the key recommendations that we got first from our group of stakeholders was to actually change the premise of the site. The site was developed initially with the goal of showing end products or deliverables, but we found out that stakeholders actually wanted to know where NOAA was working. Because scientific research can last multiple years and corals are under threats today, knowing where NOAA was working meant that they might be able to get access to preliminary results earlier and make changes to protect the reefs. So we developed this project search tool, which shows just where funded projects are. We have options to allow people to search for the last 7 years. In each project description page, will link to the products in course as they become deliverable. So that was bridging a key gap that we hadn't realized initially. Next. Another thing that we developed was pretty low tech in the sense of featured publication pages. Many of our stakeholders, because they worked across 40 different offices, had varying capabilities or access to post content to the web. So we highlight key program activities on a monthly basis, and it's summarizing the findings for both the general public as well as the scientific audience. So increasing the sort of reach of our scientific results. And through web stats, we find that this really drives up the traffic to individual publications from potentially a few hundred without a feature page to thousands or tens of thousands, depending on the scope of the report over a calendar year. Next. And finally, one of the things that we were requested for was partners wanted us to let them know proactively what we'd actually added to the catalog or the gateway. We explored a number of solutions. We were going to go down the road of RSS feeds, allowing people to customize their notifications, but early input from stakeholders told us that our users actually didn't understand RSS technology and they weren't willing to learn it. So we developed a very low-tech solution that's it's a semi-automated report to generate a quarterly report. I'm showing a screenshot on the left there. As you can see, it's not a lot of time has been invested in formatting, but it's showing the content in a manner that we could easily distribute. And it's one of the things that receives the most positive feedback from our users on a quarterly basis and is driving a lot of the traffic to the site.
Let's go ahead and open it up for panel discussions. And I feel free to open up your, turn on your camera if you'd like, or just pop in any questions into the chat. But I'm going to actually go ahead and start with the first question for our panelists. Could you talk about how you started using usability for your project? Were there any concerns or pushbacks or challenges? And mostly just kind of how do you convince others on your team that, you know, this approach is something worth investing in? And this might be a question more appropriate for Sarah and Ilya.
Sorry, let myself unmute myself here. I think we started to bring usability into the project when we realized we weren't meeting stakeholder needs. We were getting a lot of complaints from our, I guess, internal group that they had been required to submit content to us, but we weren't actually giving them the feedback or the results that they wanted. And it's been an iterative process. I know initially it was just a lot of the discussions, and we've developed a few things that Paul highlighted that, you know, people told you what they wanted, but once they actually see the end product, it's not actually what they wanted. Within the last 2 years, we've done more focused usability testing with the Science Community Gateways Institute, and it is extremely valuable and has given us new tools that I think we will incorporate in the future.
Yeah, I would echo that and say that don't follow our example on how to start with usability. Our project was already several years in, and of course we've been talking to users and showing this at workshops and getting feedback as much as we could. But and we saw that we had a pretty good idea of how to develop it further and what features to prioritize. But then we connected with the Science Gateways team and found out that we can do this thing much more systematically and efficiently. And they helped us with some areas such as usability and branding and security that we haven't really paid too much attention to. And what really helped is that we were enamored by the team that we worked with because, well, the designs and the suggestions we were getting from them were really made sense and were really helpful. In particular, when they have done systematic analysis of features of similar systems, and you know, we've been talking about discovery systems in several projects here. There are a bunch of systems that do similar things. So seeing how it is done elsewhere and what worked and what didn't was very helpful. Same as cognitive walkthrough, and that allowed us to prioritize development. And another thing that was really helpful is that as GCI team, talked with some of our users, and of course we talked with them as well, and perhaps with the same people, but getting a different perspective, and that highlighted some additional things that we might have missed. So engaging SGCI was not hard sell at all within the project. We were happy to spend sufficient time on our side to learn more about how the system works. The other project that I mentioned, the decision tree for COVID-19 and the model of COVID-19, is very different. So given everybody's interest in COVID these days, and public debate about whether to wear masks and not to wear masks, we had plenty of attention, in particular from our partners at the Health and Human Services Agency. So we had long sessions with them polishing our message before showing to the public health officer of the county and to at some point a group of about 400 school administrators from 43 school districts in San Diego. I would say that when you build a system like that, it's okay to err on the side of simplicity, especially if you have a broad audience. So make it simple to use, and it will make getting feedback easier. And also make sure that the system really delivers value to the users. And this means tracking their feedback and responding to these feedback as quickly as possible.
Great, thanks so much, Ilya. It looks like we got a question from those in the audience. Okay, so the topic of collection of usability metrics was mentioned. Have you encountered pushback related to privacy from users? Any legal hurdles that had to get cleared?
Is that for a particular person?
No, I think it's up to any of you, for all of you.
So I can jump in on that. I did a huge amount of product discovery and user research while working for Planned Parenthood to launch their telemedicine sort of offering. And often when you are doing user research, even in a corporate, maybe non-academic setting, you have people sign an agreement about how their data is going to be used. I've forgotten the name of it. Maybe Paul knows the name of it, but you can find those agreements online and or templates for them, and then use that. And then you just need to be very sensitive with sort of the data that you collect. So where your video is stored, where your notes stored, and things like that, because people are often, in our case, they were sharing health data with us or health information. And while it's not like HIPAA compliant data collection, it's still sensitive data that you just want to be mindful of where that access is.
Yeah, I don't know if I have anything useful to add. I mean, I've done several of these projects, and we regularly collect analytics data, through Google Analytics, or sometimes other services from people. These are almost all exclusively research projects, academic or national labs, things like that. And we've had some discussions about privacy, but there's always seems to be a way to work around it to get access to the data that we need, or that's useful for us from sort of a usability standpoint to see what people are doing. We don't care so much about the actual data. So I don't know a lot about the details, but there's always seems to be a way to make it work, but that's in a particular context. I'm not dealing with health, sensitive data and things like that.
Yeah, and I mean, I just know from participating in the Gateways Institute, as a government agency, we were not allowed to give Paul direct access to our Google Analytics, but there were certain key numbers that he wanted that were aggregated up for the entire year. And those aggregate numbers, as long as I provided them, versus him actually accessing our numbers directly that satisfied the privacy concerns, but it was something that we had to go up the chain for approval prior to release.
Yeah,
Great.
it's a similar situation here. We actually did not develop some components of the project as we envisioned earlier because of the need to be compliant with FERPA. So we didn't want to really spend a lot of time messing with student records and the privacy involved in that. And as a result, our decision tree, and I'm talking about the second project, is open to everybody, and you don't need to enter any personally identifiable information to use that. And then that works out okay. I'm not sure. So we're talking with several partners about going into that FERPA compliant system, but that would take longer time, and given the urgency of what we do, it's probably not going to happen.
Great, thanks. And we have another question from the audience. A question related to timing. Many products or software developed by labs have limited longevity because the primary designer leaves the organization or because the research technology has changed. How do you decide whether a product is meant to have persistent versus limited or focused usage for end users? And this is for any of the panelists.
I think sorry, Paul, you want to go ahead?
You go.
We encountered this a little bit with the data portal project at JGI. So because researchers were having such a difficult time accessing some of the data, people had built like open source scripts to like sort of access JGI's databases and stuff like that. And I think one opportunity for research organizations or institutes is to take a project that may be retired and make it open source. So like turn the code over, put it in a public repository. So if someone wants to maintain it, they have the ability to do so. But also people can come in and find that if they need to do that sort of research in the future. And so it becomes upon the community to maintain it or update it. And that might be one way or one option for, older projects.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what I can say that's useful for that question. I think it's sort of depends on the project and the people involved and the community, which is somewhat independent of usability and user-centered design. The only thing I can think of, I know that funding agencies and in general and NSF in particular are putting more emphasis on sort of software sustainability in terms of funding research projects. And one of the ways that you can think about that is through is usability, essentially, and that if you're making usable software that's useful for a community of people, it's more likely to be sustainable and used long term, even if the original developer goes somewhere. If it is really useful, someone else might pick it up and maintain it. Otherwise, I don't know. Otherwise, I just think it's up to the project and how specific the software is, and whether it's a one-time use thing or whether it's something that will really fit the needs of the community.
Great, thanks, Linda and Paul. So I have another question here. Are there any goals that you couldn't have accomplished without the use of user-centered design, or any pitfalls that you avoided because you use this approach? This might be a question for Linda.
Yeah, I mean, we would have gone down a completely incorrect path if we hadn't talked to researchers and kind of understood how the research was evolving, how their use of the data was evolving, and also how they perceived the Joint Genome Institute. So their perception was that it was a single entity, but inside the Joint Genome Institute, they saw themselves as 5 very distinct departments doing their own thing. And when we brought that feedback back to them, they were like, oh, okay. And I was like, look, so this genome portal or this data portal that we ended up replacing the genome portal, I'm like, look, this is the central component in this whole ecosystem. So like all your data is going to flow through this to get downloaded. And so it was just shifting their mindset about how they thought about their own institute. And so I think it's really important to go out and do this work. And that's why I said at the beginning, if you're working on an existing product, it's really important to get curious, like really embrace your inner 3-year-old and keep asking why. I cannot emphasize that enough. Don't write down all of your assumptions and make sure you test for them, because, another example, when I was at Planned Parenthood, they had launched a pilot video telemedicine project, and they had made a bunch of assumptions going in. And when I came in, I was like, I have some hypotheses that some of these might not be correct. And so we went out and did a set of user research around that. And sure enough, some of them I wasn't sure what the correct thing would be, but others I was like, yeah, I'm pretty sure that people aren't going to want this type of STD testing at home. It's just not like, they don't even know what these STDs are. So sorry to go into detail, but and so we were able to validate that with user research. So it's that discovery phase is really important. And the one thing I would say is that if you haven't read this book and you do user research, I highly recommend it, especially for new product discovery. It's a really good guide for teaching you how to talk to people without kind of giving away your idea, and getting biased feedback. So we're all kind of within the scientific community. And so if we think about, well, I'm not, but the rest of you are, but if we we're on a very scientific approach to this. But if we think about, not wanting to bias our research project, that's what that book really does, is it teaches you how to not bias that early research.
Thanks, Linda. Go ahead, sorry.
That looking at users and doing the user research is really critical, but then sometimes your users change very quickly over the life of your project. So for example, in the decision tree project, that was initially meant for school nurses, and they would go to that system, figure out what to do given particular circumstances of each student, and then generate instructions that they would send to parents. But what happened is that with the recent Omicron peak, schools became overwhelmed themselves, so they overwhelmed with tracking their own infected and exposed staff. And so they started to email our link directly to parents and posted a link to school websites. As a result, our audience suddenly changed completely. And thus, in this fashion, usability requirements changed. So we had to adjust the language, not to mention, following the ever-changing guidelines from CDC and California Department of Public Health. And we started to get different type of feedback. So I guess one of the measures of impact in this type of work is if you get attention from COVID deniers. So on that measure of success, we have something to show for sure. So one of the lessons we learned is to embed feedback mechanism directly in your instrument, despite some unfortunate feedback that you can sometimes get. Well, basically it's stating that we waste taxpayers' money, their money. And I wish it's a volunteer project. So, and by the way, if you have kids at school, especially in California, you may find this tool useful. So just Google San Diego County decision tree.
Great, thank you, Ilya. So I'm being aware of the time. And we do have one more question in the shared doc, but I'll share it with the panelists and they will respond to that asynchronously after, because I know we're out of time, but it was another really good question that came up as well. The last thing I really wanted to do is just do a quick thank you to all of the panelists today. We had a really great discussion and just so many wonderful questions. So really appreciate that. And I hope that you all learned something today and are motivated to contribute or implement your own approach of using UCD. The last thing I wanted to quickly do is just do a quick shout out to our next community conversation next month. And this is actually focused on data citations. So I think it's going to be a really great conversation, and please bookmark that time if you're interested. But yeah, thanks so much again. This recording will be made available on our website. So look for it on Twitter and on our website in the next couple of days. And thanks again for our presenters for joining.